Wait.
So, are we ready? 2 minutes. Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We start our first webinar. We are going to have more webinars, global webinars devoted to the issues that education faces under the current situation, under the pandemic, school and university closures, etc. This seminar is a joint initiative between the World Bank, National Research University High School of Economics from Moscow, and a group of other universities, other leading universities that will be involved on during the later stages, later webinars, including Polytechnic of Milano, University of Oxford, Peking University, University of Berkeley, and some other universities. Today, because this is our first webinar and many people participate in this webinar and use this software WebEx for the first time, let me give you a few technical recommendations. First, please mute your mic using the button on the bottom, in the bottom left side of the screen with the microphone. The icon should be red. If you don't do that, our technical moderator can mute you. But it would be better if you do that by yourself. Then please turn off the video, not to overload the platform. Also use the icon in the bottom with the camera. It should be also red. And if you want to ask questions or provide comments, please write them in the chat. You see the black button with 3 dots, and then you can see the chat, and just put your question or your comment there, and I, as a moderator, will direct it to the presenters, to the presenter or to the discussant. Also, probably that's it for the beginning. If you have any technical problems with this particular software, also you can write about that in the chat. And a few words about the topic of the seminar and how are we going to proceed. We're going to spend 90 minutes together, and we have a key presentation. Then we have 2 discussants, and then there will be questions Q&A session based on your questions and comments. If you don't have them enough, we can finish earlier. We are particularly pleased to have Harry Patrinas as the key presenter here. Harry is not just an important person in the World Bank. He is a global practice manager for Europe and Central Asia in education, but also one of the leading education economists today. He wrote and published extensively on different issues on economics of education, education and development. He teaches in different universities. We are pleased that he gave a few classes at High School of Economics as well. And recently, he and his colleagues published I would say, heartbreaking paper, very short but very interesting, on learning losses during the current pandemic situation. So Harry will give the key presentation, and then we have two great discussants. They are from the other part of other side of Atlantic. Professor Tommaso Agasisti is professor of the business school and associate dean at Polytechnic of Milano, one of the best Italian universities. And Tommaso also is famous education economist. He publishes a lot about efficiency and effectiveness of education. So he will provide also economics of education perspective. And it will be especially interesting since Italy now is, we hope, at least on the recovery stages after being hit terribly by the pandemic. And the second discussant is Professor Sergey Kosaretskiy from the Institute of Education of the High School of Economics. Sergey is expert in educational policy, and he is particularly interested in inequality, school and students' resilience, and long-term consequences of school failure. So each discussant will have up to 10 minutes for the comments. Sergey will have several slides, and then our key presenter and discussants can ask questions themselves, each other, and members of the audience also can ask the questions. So why don't we start? And I would ask to put first slide. Harry, the floor is yours, and I mute my mic.
Thank you, Isak. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. It's a pleasure to be with you, and an honor to have this shared platform with HSE. I will briefly present the work we are doing. It's ongoing work, an attempt to look at the costs of school closures, and in this case, taking the perspective of wages lost due to the loss of schooling, taking from the human capital theory that schooling is an investment. So if we're deprived of the opportunity to invest, then the return should go down. So it's that simple assumption. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay, thank you. So let me begin, and the context for this, of course, is the unprecedented school closures that we're still experiencing. At one point in mid-April, 192 countries had closed their universities and schools, affecting upwards of 90% of the world's learners, about 1.6 billion children and young people. This event, of course, done for the reason of reducing the infection rates. There's quite a literature on school closures and the impact on the economy and the impact on health outcomes. The controversial literature on health outcomes, and we've seen in the press how this is playing out with some of the school openings over the last couple of weeks. And of course, some people are sending messages they can't hear me. Others are sending messages they hear me. I don't know the consensus on this. I can try to speak louder, but I'm not sure that's the problem. It could be the connection with the phone or such. I would try turning off videos and muting in case that helps. Okay, so somebody's trying to figure it out. I'll continue in the interest of time. So we've had this unprecedented event of school closures due to the pandemic, and this has been a global phenomenon that we are living through. We also have some evidence. I wouldn't say a lot of evidence. We do have evidence on what happens during pandemics. We know that the effects are long lasting, and I would say very long lasting. By coincidence, several studies were published just before the COVID epidemic. In fact, one study was looking at the impact of the 1918 influenza and how this has affected generations of people. So looking first at the cohorts of people that were in utero during the pandemic and looking at what is happening in later years, increased disability, lower incomes, and in fact, the pandemic reduced incomes by up to 9%. So significant impacts over a long period of time. The other related literature would be recession years, because not only is this a pandemic that we're living through, it's also a recession year. And there is a literature on what happens to people that graduate in a recession year. And the evidence there is quite conclusive in terms of the earnings losses that young people experience, and that they last at least a decade, if not more. And the impact is about a 10% reduction in wages due to just graduating in a recession year. The other literature has been trying to estimate the impact of lost GDP, and there the impacts depend on how severe the pandemic is. It could be less than 1% of GDP. It could be as much as 10% of GDP. And that is a single year estimate. So it could be quite a big hit into the economy. The only really comparable epidemics that we have are the Black Death that goes way back in time and led to perhaps 75 million dead. Definitely reducing labor force, but created a higher agricultural wage. The Spanish flu, a bit more recent, 100 million dead, and definitely devastating impacts on labor markets and considerably lower incomes as a result. In terms of school closures, there is evidence from events that are not pandemic related, but the Cultural Revolution in China, again, recent research, coincidentally, that has demonstrated the impact this has on completion rates in high school, significant reduction, and significantly lower labor market outcomes, including lower incomes. The other fact from research about school closures is that the loss in earnings is not distributed equally. It seems that those in lower paying jobs tend to suffer the sharpest losses. Of course, we haven't had pandemics at this global level and with this level of lockdown, and the early evidence from some of the labor force assessments has suggested that maybe this time some of the impacts are at the higher ends as well, given that some people with essential jobs may be protected, but we'll see where this takes us. Another fact of school disruptions is that those who already had more education to begin with seem to fare better. During these kinds of crises, but especially after. Show some of that research in a moment. So we do expect differentiated effects as a result of the return to schooling. Could everyone mute, please? I'm still getting sound. Thank you. So the differentiated effects could be that the returns to schooling rise because many people will suffer from unemployment, and if this unemployment increase is concentrated among those with less education, it will raise the wages of those who are higher levels of education and already employed. Also, these crises create a pool of unemployed, which dampens their wages. We've looked at the case of Argentina over a fairly long period of time, a decade of volatility, to say the least, and the evidence is quite clear that the earnings of those with higher levels of education have been less affected by the crisis than the earnings of less educated. All the earnings may have gone down, but they go down less for those with more education, and then soon after crisis, the gaps favor those with more education. So overall, the evidence that we have so far before COVID-19 is that the educated, the better educated, fare better. And this is from evidence in terms of the level of education. I haven't mentioned quality yet. So a bit of theory from human capital theory. We know that educational attainment increases people's productive skills, their cognitive skills. We also know from the literature that educated workers are better able to cope with changes. Read Schultz on the value of education. Clearly, crises that create disruptions and disequilibria, as he wrote, favor those with better education. And also, the theory is that those with more and better education are better able to seek and use information about jobs and to protect themselves going forward. They're able to get information about job opportunities from family, friends, so on, labor bureaus, and it's beneficial. Again, better educated are likely to cope better during the crisis, and during the recovery will consolidate their position. Less educated will suffer more, and as a result, after the crisis, the gaps are expected to increase. A few ideas about what we might see going forward. What happens if the earnings of the educated go down in equal proportion to those that are less educated? Not clear what will happen to the returns to education. They may remain unchanged, but if the earnings of the less educated go down more, then the returns to education increase. And this is what we've seen in many of the past crises. But if the earnings of the better educated decrease more, then we'll see a decrease in the returns. This seems to happen much less often, but this crisis may be different because of the differential effects on so-called essential workers, but it still needs to be played out. So I mentioned the case of Argentina and what seems to happen in terms of the returns to education. So here's a graphic of the returns, which is the dark dotted line on top, and the red curve showing what happened to GDP over this period, 1992. And you can see the volatility, tremendous volatility in economic output in Argentina, but the returns to schooling remained quite stable and actually increased over the period of crisis and into the recovery. In the case of Mexico, a little bit different, but the returns to education over this very long period and two significant economic downturns in the country. During the first downturn on the chart, there was a decrease in the returns to schooling and then a rapid increase in the recovery. But then during the next crisis, a decrease even into the crisis year. So a little bit different than what happened in Argentina. Venezuela, another country with significant economic volatility in the 80s and 90s, continues to this day. But just looking at this past period, a remarkably stable returns to education, I would say, despite the decline in the late 80s and 90s, and then a significant recovery even during later downturns. If we look at levels of education, and here secondary and higher education, and again the case of Argentina with a slightly longer time period up to 2012, so we incorporate now also the recession of 2009. The returns to higher education seem to be increasing even during crisis years, and the downturn has affected those with secondary education much more. This is also consistent with findings in the United States and well documented in the work of Golden and Katz, who looked at how education contributed to more equity during most of the 20th century, but by the end of the 20th century tended to favor those with more education, and therefore education seems to be contributing to increased inequality. A very different picture when we look at education, and seems to conform to the theory that was laid out moments ago. So on cost of pandemics, there is a literature on this, a growing literature, I would say. One of the significant outcomes of this pandemic has been the level of research that has gone on, especially on the health and medical aspects, but also on the social and economic effects. So for some of the past pandemics, there's a literature on the likely impacts of school closures from past events. We've had other events much more localized where schools had to be closed, whether it was for SARS. There's a literature on school closures and teacher union activities, and there's also a literature on disruptions from wars, and we saw this in the case of China. But from the more recent literature in the UK, school closures could cost 0.1 to 0.4 of GDP, a 4-week school closure, pretty significant one-off impact. In the US, estimates have been shown for 4 weeks closures of GDP impact of 0.3%. And this is due entirely to absenteeism and productivity losses, meaning that people not showing up to work because of the lockdown and the ensuing productivity losses due to the lack of labor. So it's a current loss that's estimated here due solely to worker absenteeism productivity. That study did not account for learning losses or for future earnings losses. A very recent study out of Norway presented an estimate of the impact of school closures in that country, and they estimate a one-off loss of over $200 million just for those students whose progress was delayed, plus another $165 million for each day schools remain closed. That model uses a methodology that estimates future earnings that will be lost due to the closures and that resulted in less education. So the school closures, you get less education. We know what the impact of future earnings is likely to be, so they estimated these losses for future earnings penalties due to the school closures in Norway. So the cost of school closures, we assume that these will reduce learning. So if you're not in school, you're not learning. You're also getting less education. So if the past estimates of relationship between education and earnings have shown that a year of schooling it increases your earnings. If you get less schooling, by definition, that should reduce your earnings. But why? The reason would be the lost productivity. So if you're learning less, then presumably you're less productive, and this should be borne out in your work productivity and show up in the lost wages going forward. The question is, by how much will earnings decline? And this, of course, depends on many factors, but at this point, all we can do is forecast based on averages and means. There are other conditions, but we'll simplify this to look at the impact on earnings due to lost years of education. So from the literature, we know that every year of schooling increases earnings by about 9% a year. This varies by country, varies by region, but on average, the global estimate is that a year of schooling is about 9% in additional future earnings. So we use this number, which is not a lot of variation across the world. The latest compilation that we did shows the returns are about 9%. A little bit less in high income countries, a bit higher in lower income countries, but pretty stable and consistent estimate of the returns to schooling, which have remained quite stable over a relatively long period of time. So what we attempt to do in this ongoing work is to estimate the earnings losses due to getting less education. And of course, we take the human capital view that schooling is an investment and increases productivity, which should be borne out in wages. So less schooling should mean less earnings. So using the 9% figure on additional earnings, we estimate that the number of months of closures will reduce your earnings. So if for example, the whole school year was lost, we'd say that a year of schooling loss is 9%. We use that number. So we're estimating about a quarter or a third of a year, depending how long the year in schooling is, assuming that a 4-month closure from March to June would reduce future earnings by about 2.5% a year if we take the estimate as a quarter of a year. I apply this assumption to the world's largest economy, the United States, which has currently 76 million students. So by simple extrapolation and discounting of future earnings, we're able to estimate the loss. The loss we estimate with assuming a 45-year working life, about $50,000 in the case of the United States. We also take account to some extent the mitigation, because as soon as schools were closed, countries initiated their distance education programs. In some countries, online learning, and others, other means have been used, television, radio, and the like. Some have had very good coverage, others perhaps less so. we estimated a very conservative estimation that assuming that only 10% of students would lose some of the education because of distance education. In terms of the distance education, there's also the question of coverage, quality of education, which we're not able to ascertain at this point, but in future research will be able to look at how good the distance education provision has been. And then there's, of course, the question of access. While you could have even high quality distance education and very wide coverage, there are other aspects of access which could be related to internet devices or just time to access the resources. We also don't account yet for the learning loss. So one of the assumptions of this school is out on opportunity. That's why you still hear me okay? I'm getting a lot of feedback. Okay. I think somebody needs to mute. The other aspect is how much of the school closure will affect learning loss, and of course this should have an effect on earnings as well. There is some early research for the United States suggesting pretty significant effects of maybe a third of the year lost in terms of learning, and without mitigation. And the coming summer, at least for Northern Hemisphere countries, would be up to half a year of learning loss. In addition to that, quarter of a year that might be lost in educational attainment, there could be an even more significant learning loss. So that measure we haven't yet accounted for, but it's possible to include learning loss into the analysis. So in the United States, the losses in terms of earnings would be about over $1,000 per year per student, which sounds like a small price to pay for people's security and safety during the pandemic, but over a lifetime, it's about $33,000. Again, might sound like a small price to pay again, but for society, given how large the school system is, 76 million students, we estimate this could be up to $2.5 trillion worth of earnings losses over a very long period of time, but it is a significant level of resources that could be lost just because of the schooling closures of just 4 months in the United States. Of course, it depends on other measures, but this is the first estimate that we have come up with. More than half the U.S. states have decided to keep schools closed during this last semester, and given the lack of vaccine and orders to end the lockdown, this might also affect opportunities to have summer school and the like. Of course, this could change, but this earnings loss, may well materialize given the closures. Also in the press, I think just today, several universities are suggesting that they won't open at all in the fall. Cambridge has announced online classes for the whole year, so we're likely to see, if not full closures, intermittent closures, and then the impact on earnings loss will depend on just how much of the education can be made up through the online and other measures that might be possible. But this first estimate of earnings losses may very well materialize the longer these lockdowns last, and how quickly we're able to get schools back up and running in the fall and make up for this earning loss in countries. So in terms of global impacts, this is ongoing work, but a few things are clear. There are more students in middle-income countries than in high-income or low-income countries, just because these are most of the countries in the world are middle-income, highest levels of population in these countries. So more students will be affected in those middle-income countries. Of course, people in higher income countries will earn higher earnings, so they stand to lose more in terms of total earnings. But even in low income countries, where the amounts compared to high income countries might appear quite small, these could be devastating losses, given that we're talking about countries with high levels of poverty and low levels of income to begin with. So relatively small amounts of losses in these countries could well have disastrous effects on their economies going forward. But that's the preliminary view we're likely to see in our future global impacts of the school. So some of the limitations of the work that we've done, we haven't learning losses yet. And we also haven't controlled for the quality of schooling across countries, and something that is worth considering. We haven't controlled the quality of schooling across the United States either. But this is possible in theory to control for, and we know that the quality of schooling also affects future earnings. We also haven't adjusted yet for labor force participation, so there could be even greater losses if we account for unemployment. There are some studies that have come out already suggesting that some of the COVID job losses may be permanent. And we haven't adjusted yet also for a differential effect. Females from past economic crisis, the Great Recession, the US, males seem to be hurt more than females, but we don't know what the impact will be. We haven't also yet done any work on the distributional aspect. So we do know that past crises have affected lower income groups more. We don't know what the distributional aspect of this crisis might be. The early assessments are a bit ambiguous, but it is possible to at least estimate some distributional aspects in future work. Also, we haven't yet looked at the forecast the effects by level of education. I mentioned earlier that past crises, at least in Latin America, have suggested the effects are stronger, negative and stronger for those with lower levels of education. That was also a finding in the US after the Great Recession, and also in Europe, again, the recent economic crisis. Research in Greece suggests that those with higher levels of education also managed better during the crisis. So another area of future work. So a few discussion questions that I might suggest in the going forward is the future question that we tend to study is the impact on young peoples between rich and poor countries. What would be the effect across countries? And then within countries, which groups of children young are likely to suffer most from this education lockdown, And then how much of this sacrifice that young people are making because of their lost education compares to the sacrifice made by other parts of the population. Difficult question, which has ethical connotations, I'm sure. A few recommendations that it seemed to me to follow from this work. One is the quality of education will definitely take a hit as a result of these school closures, and when children go back to school in September, we will need to look at their level of education and to support their recovery, their learning recovery, and bring up the levels of schooling. There's also youth that may be close to compulsory school age that might tend towards dropping out as a result of the crisis. So it puts pressure to maintain education spending and perhaps to target it better to support those who are likely to suffer the most. For those that will have left the education system, there is a need to think about income support, employment support to ensure that these initial costs don't lead to permanent scarring on young people that have entered the labor market. And then I think one of the obvious revelations from this school closure is that all systems need to invest in digital skills and technology. The difficulties, even in high-income countries, of providing consistent learning opportunities during the school closures has become apparent. Our distance learning models that were not designed for mass school closures, and they weren't designed for taking care of so many children during such a big and impactful crisis. So thinking about the digital skills of students, but also their teachers who need to provide the lessons during the lockdown, and better technology so that more people connect consistently. There's been heroic efforts in countries to use different means to extend coverage using television, radio, and the like. But if you need the interconnectivity and connections and live connections during the lockdown, then better technology would definitely be in line. So thank you, and look forward to discussion and questions.
Harry, thank you very much. You're on time. And again, I would ask everyone to use chat for the communication, except our official discussants. Otherwise, we'll be hearing each other. It will be maybe very entertaining, but we'll not hear that, hear the discussants. So I would turn the floor, give the floor to Professor Tommaso Agasisti. Tommaso, I'm sorry, I introduced you as a professor of School of Business, and you are professor of School of Management. So that's a difference.
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, and Harry, switch off your mic, please. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Isak, for the opportunity of discussing this interesting presentation by Harry. I'm so disappointed that there is not a function applause in this app, because I really wanted to make an applause to the kind of work that Harry presented today. I had the privilege of reading the slides in advance, so I had a few time to reflect on what Harry had presented right now to us. And I have to offer basically few reflections and few comments and maybe few questions also to Harry, and I hope they can stimulate the debate between us. So first of all, my overall judgment is that this presentation is great for mainly three reasons. So the first one is that it is great to look at the long run effects of this crisis. So there's a lot of attention right now focused on the immediate short run effect of this pandemic on education. And so a lot of debate is focused on this learning loss that we are expecting. And of course, it can be super dangerous for the future of the educational system, of course. But I think the angle that Harry presented about how this will transform into income loss and wage loss is an additional point which is super important. And then it helps us to look forward to the next steps of problems we have to face. And so it also raised the attention of policymakers to consider, a time span which is a little bit longer than the one that is right now at the center of public debate. Of course, one potential direction of developing this analysis is to try to combine as much as possible this long time perspective with the short one. So having somehow the possibility to see together how the effects on wages and how the effects of learning losses are combined together in the short run would be super useful. The second point for which this presentation is great is that it provides a framework for make simulations at country level. So it is proposing a method that has its big potential on being applied in different countries, and then estimate through these simulations the likely effects in different countries. So we have seen the estimation provided for the United States of America, but I'm thinking how useful and interesting can be to provide estimations for different countries and compare how heterogeneous can be the effect of this closure once we use some hypothesis to try to analyze this. The reason why it is a great point in my view is that it can be really used by policymakers. It can become a tool really used by policymakers to make reflections on this point. The third strength of this presentation is that it takes a global perspective. So it is stimulating an interesting reflection about how the differential effects of pandemic can be in different areas of the world. And so again, here, if you move the attention from the national or local policymaker, and we look at how international organizations can take care of or can propose solutions for the situations we are living, then having estimations which are looking, more globally at the problem can provide interesting instruments to these international level policymakers to arrange their own, suggestions and probably coordinate policies at a higher level than just the national one. Then I want to, in any case, focus on some points of attention. So some, I would say, critical reading of what Harry presented to us, and offer something that I hope can help him and colleagues to try to develop the model a step further. The first one is they are making a lot of assumptions for simulating the effects of losing of school closure on education and as a consequence on wages. So testing different assumptions can be super useful, and especially I would suggest to consider the gradient. Education salaries can be very different. So it can be the case that in the existing analysis of the relationship of the returns to education can actually be somehow structurally modified by the current pandemic and the way in which the economy and society will look like tomorrow. So it would be great if, by stretching a little bit the assumptions, the boundaries across the current level of returns to education, can be provided some lower bound and upper bound effects based on some hypotheses on these returns on education. Also, I think the world of tomorrow in the new normal will have very different, returns to education on different skills and tasks on job. So the current literature, which is looking at how returns to education are different for abstract, manual, or routine tasks are likely to be disrupted by the current situation, and how the job market will look like in the future is also like to have an effect on how the school closure is affecting the skills of today's students, and now they can be used in the future market. And of course, I liked very much this discussion that Harry presented at the end about how, for example, some skills are more critical than others, you know, and are likely to have different returns. So think about how the digital skills are becoming a key for, you know, whatever job in the next future. The second point I want to suggest is I like the idea of having looked at the past pandemic as a benchmark for making some analysis, but I want to stimulate a reflection that for education is super important. That is, there is a huge, big difference today with the ones pandemic in the past. That is, once in the past, when school closure was there, the only source of inequality was related to different parents and different socioeconomic backgrounds. But then today, the digital tools were supposed to act as a mitigation effect for the school closure. And it is paradoxically adding another source of inequality, which is not only how the parents and backgrounds are different, but also how the access and use of digital technology is different. And so this time, on one side, there is a presumption that digital tools can be used for reducing the effect of school closure. But on the other end, it can be the case that actually it is creating a different way of reacting, a different way of mitigating that school closure. So somehow taking into account these or some proxies for these can be super difficult, of course, because you know you need a lot of data, but at the same time having some speculation on how technology can act in the counter direction of the one which is presumed to be can be useful. The third point I want to raise is about the efficiency of schools. So if we look at the institutions which are producing education, which then is reflected into wages, we should expect that one of the long-term effects of this pandemic is that a different use of technology is likely to change structurally the production process of the educational institutions. So the way in which, so during this school closure time, there is a net, wage loss, but there will be also an effect when the schools will reopen on the way in which they will adjust to the new production process. So how much they will use technology, how much they will try to replace current way of teaching with new ones, and which are the effects of using a different production process, which is using technology stronger in creating human capital or in favoring human capital, and so in having effects in the long run. So we are at the beginning of radical change in the way in which schools operate, and caused by the COVID experience, and it is going to have a long-lasting effect on the way in which schools operate. Two more short points, because I know I have just a few minutes. The first one is, in this model, it will be super interesting to look at what I can call the indirect effect of this school closure on parents, jobs, and salaries. So in the overall count of the wage losses, I think that one current situation that should be looked at is how much is going to have an effect, the school closure, on the current parents' jobs and salaries. And this should be somehow added to the count of the long-term effect in terms of wages and labor market, I would say, of the crisis of this pandemic school closure. And I think this can really enrich the picture about how the socioeconomic system is reacting to this school closure situation. And then finally, a suggestion to Harry, the case of Italy is super interesting. we were among the first closing the schools. We closed the schools in the final week of February. We are going not to reopen the schools until September. Then it means that we had lost, so we closed the schools for March, April, May, and part of June, which is between 13 and 14 weeks. So the effect here is likely to be one of the upper bound estimation of the effect. So applying the model you are suggesting to the case of Italy will be, in my view, an interesting contribution to the policy debate we are having in Italy, also because we decided to keep the schools closed, so the government decided to keep the school closed until September in all the country. And I understand the health, concerns, but I think that when they made that decision, a clear framework taking into account all the factors, including the likely longer term effects that are going to affect the current students into the schools, were not properly or completely taken into account. Thank you very much for your contribution on this, because I think it is going to help us in better understanding what is going on.
Thank you very much, Professor Agasisti. I hope the colleagues, the participants of the webinar, we have about 100 people, will have questions to you, to Harry, and to our next discussant, the second discussant, Professor Sergey Kosaretskiy. He has a presentation which will appear in the moment. Thank you. Sergey, we have your presentation and you can start.
We cannot hear Sergey.
Sergey, we cannot hear you. Could the technical support help us?
Sergey, please switch on microphone.
Нет, нет. Сергей, включи
You're muted
микрофон.
now.
Okay. Try now. No, you're muted again. It shows that it's muted. Okay? No.
We lost Sergey.
Yeah, we cannot hear.
Sergey, you did something last time when we were connecting. You did something last time and it started working. Maybe you should disconnect the wireless or these wires from your ears.
But Sergey is not connected anymore.
No, he is. You can see him.
We can see him, but we cannot hear him.
He is connected and his microphone unmuted.
Yeah. Okay, you can reload that. So what would be, Sergey Kiselev, what would be your advice? You can communicate privately with Sergey and we can ask questions and comments from the audience. And we'll ask our technical support to fix Sergey's presentation and Sergey's participation, but I would ask Harry and Tommaso to respond to few comments and questions that we received. And one of them is, why don't you discuss, probably it's to Harry, why don't you discuss the questions of educational outcomes? So what do you expect any changes in educational outcomes as a kind of intermediary between the labor market outcomes? And again, unlike Spanish flu in early 20s of the 20th century, we now have PISA and national tests, etc. Are we going to have any data that will show the changes in outcomes? And if we can do an experiment or a study, how would you recommend to design it? It's a question to both Harry and Tommaso. Who wants to take it first?
I can start up, Isak, and first I want to thank Tommaso for the thoughtful comments and suggestions. All of them are theoretically doable, even with the simple model we have. It's a question of timing, and it relates also to the last question you asked about measuring actual outcomes. So I guess the trade-off is how much work should one do on forecasting potential losses as opposed to measuring the actual losses. But definitely some of these assumptions can be incorporated in the model, and we will do our best to do some of these. And then going to the last question, hopefully when data becomes available, we can even the assumptions we made. So thank you for those suggestions, Tommaso. And I think the case of Italy is a very, very important one for many reasons. Even the long school closures would be a good case. And it goes again to the last question on measuring. I know Italy has a very good measurement system. In fact, applied for a human capital index for the regions of Italy. So you have tests across regions. So I think for an education researcher in Italy, there could be some very important findings to show the actual impact of the school closures and the distribution across Italy's regions. So if you don't know Italy, there's quite some diversity in a small country in terms of the outcomes across regions. Going to the questions that Isak relayed from the participants, I think the expected impact of education, other education outcomes, is something that we want to incorporate. We are working on it. We will do it soon. And the bank will have a model for this as well. On the question about expected changes and outcomes, even before labor market outcomes, I think the most immediate ones are both the immediate short-term impacts of job losses, the more medium to long-term impact on jobs that may be lost forever, or restructuring of the labor markets, which was coming, the technological revolution anyways, and this pandemic and recession will definitely lead to some changes, as Tommaso mentioned. So we do expect large impacts on employment, but also in terms of the long-term productivity and how this will affect people. An interesting case would be teachers. We know how vital teachers are to the educational process. In many countries, teachers are at an advanced age and could be at an age where likely to be affected by the disease. So there is a threat to, are we going to get our grade teachers back in the classroom when schools reopen. So that's an open question. In terms of measuring outcomes, I think PISA and TIMSS is great, but I think that the timing of these won't allow for immediate measurement of the impact. If we had an assessment that happened to take place just before the pandemic, and then something when the schools reopened, hopefully in the fall, it would give us good data for measuring this. I think some of the states in different countries that do yearly assessments. In the U.S., many states have their own. There's also a national assessment. There, people will be able to quickly monitor the actual impact of the learning losses in countries. Some countries do have in their national assessments yearly tests. Again, this gives them the opportunity to do something. I think even more important would be when schools reopen to have some kind of rapid assessment that allows to measure the impact of the lost learning over the summer, and to allow people to design the learning recovery program to take account for this. My prediction is that there will be learning loss, and it will be distributed unevenly. And those poor students with less access to resources will suffer more. The teacher will face an incoming class with a wider distribution of learning needs, and makes it very difficult to cater to that classroom. The more heterogeneous, the more difficult it is to manage and to teach. And if the teachers don't know the levels of all these students, it'll be difficult to cater to that. So we need a rapid assessment tool that will measure learning loss, but with an aim towards providing teachers with the tool they need to cater their lessons. Mm-hmm. The paradox is, what Tommaso said. In the past, your learning recovery would depend completely on your family resources, parents' education. This time, we should have had a more democratic access to learning given the internet, but now there's the digital divide, which will favor those with the connection. So again, those are resourced. Thank you.
Thank you. And let us try again with Sergey. I hope we resolve technical difficulties. Sergey, could you try, please? No, it doesn't work. No, we see this again. Maybe you can use just telephone for the connection, and our host will show the presentation. Is it visible? And before the colleagues will try, I will ask the second question, and again, maybe Tommaso will start with relatively brief answer on that. A few participants mentioned that the big difference between this situation and the situation on, let's say again, Spanish flu, is that we had some substitute as online teaching or distance teaching. So, frankly speaking, when I took your paper for the first time, I made an assumption that the difference, that let's say students will lose not completely these 4 months, but they lose 50%. So what would you, how would you estimate how distance education help to substitute the teaching? And I would ask again Maria Jacques-Soubey to switch off the mic. Please, Tommaso, would you like to take this question first?
Yeah, well, if you want to brief, I think that it goes between 90% and 0. I think the situation is so heterogeneous. So I am aware of several examples here in Italy in which still today, after more than 10 weeks of closure, there are some schools which didn't start a proper, mitigation plan through technology. And at the same time, I am aware of schools that since the few days after, they are keeping the same teaching time that they had before, and even through the technology can help the students keeping pace more than before because they can be that much more in a much more personalized way. So I think that here the key is not to try to estimate an average. Well, it is for the kind of paper that Harry is preparing, and it is super useful at system level. We can, probably imagine that it is something that lies between 30 and 60% of mitigation coming from technology on average. But then once we have this, and of course, in that wonderful model, it can be simulated to see how much does it change in terms of future wages if it is 30 instead of 60, and then it only ex post it is possible to look at this problem empirically. But then the point is actually to look at the distributions within country. And I want to tell you just one word, and maybe something that Harry can try to foster from his sitting in World Bank. It is, we just started in Italy with my university a project in which what we did is we will survey the teachers of students who will be tested next year. So the idea is to try to see whether the differential use of technology is going to have an effect on the way in which students, or at least are correlated with the way in which students report their scores next year. So it can be a way of looking at the problem. It's not estimating a learning loss. It is much more to look at the heterogeneity of the mitigation effect. But then it's something that maybe in other countries can be, set as a potential design. And we have this time window before the final academic year is finishing, in which maybe even short information and data can help us a lot in understanding a little bit more what is going on.
So, Harry, how would you take this question? How would you respond to this question?
I think the distribution question is key, and not really possible to other than to predict a range. But I think the point that Tommaso makes about how prepared students will be next year because of the lack of technology is a key one. There's already evidence from PISA that shows that those students, 15-year-olds who have less access to technology, fare significantly worse in the PISA test. So that's a pretty good measure of people's preparedness for either further study or world of work. So you already have a deficit for those who don't have technology, and now the only way to get a good education during the lockdown would be access to technology. So those lack of digital, and that's digital skills, not even just access, digital skills, those with less access will do significantly less, worse. So yes, mitigation is possible, and it may be working great. We don't know, we'll see. But I think even a small loss is something that will last, right? So if a year of schooling is important, and we all, I think everyone connected here, safe to say, believe that education contributes to learning and productivity. Therefore, any lack of education will have less of an effect. Online teaching, I'm sure many of you have done it before, but is different from emergency education, which is what we're doing now. So our systems, our online distance education systems, were not designed for pandemic responses. They're not emergency. They are distance education systems, and the literature shows that for those students, and you know them, motivated students who can learn anywhere will do very well in an online environment. But people have different learning styles. On average, the best distance education system is a blended learning system, something that we can't do because of the pandemic. So there is learning loss. I think we tried to be conservative in the estimates. Someone can say, well, mitigation might work better than you assume. We assumed a pretty high impact of mitigation, and we still get what I would say alarming numbers. So the idea is if you do nothing, there will be huge consequences in terms of labor market outcomes. But there are things you can do when the schools reopen that might help mitigate the long-term impacts. That's the point. And then the more difficult part is, what do you do about youth that were already at risk of dropping out and may drop out because of this crisis? That's going to be a more difficult policy response.
Thank you. Another question from it's a comment, but I reformulate it as a question from David Hawker from UK. That's an interesting point, because during the lockdown, many families stayed with kids. So it's not just school closure, it's completely different family environment. So again, do you have in your model, and maybe that's a question to Harry, and the question to Tommaso is, do you have another model to take into account this difference and the role of families? And in fact, the simple question for future studies could be, if we have distance education, so how it mitigates the risks of learning losses for different families' environment or for different types of students. So how would you comment the role of families in this situation?
Extremely critical, and I think that's going to be the difference. And I think Tommaso was making the point that this crisis should have had less of an access issue because of technology. The problem is the access to technology. So in theory, we should have equitable access, because if you had everything online and it worked well, that it's difficult to exclude people, right? So if we think of schools may be able to exclude people by not enrolling them. If you make everything online and accessible, everyone has it. But then we have the inequalities of digital access, even just space in the home. Reports from some of the rapid surveys that have been done, even in homes where children do have internet access and the system is pretty good, just not having space to do your work. We're seeing that even in surveys of staff, the difficulty of home-based work. So there are many aspects that we had, as educators, had considered in a system of mass lockdown. In our model, we aren't able to yet model this. I think in future learning loss work, it can definitely be done. And when we do get some of the surveys of actual learning loss, we'll be able to make some of these estimates. But judging from the literature that exists, definitely the family remains important despite the widespread use of technology today.
Okay, Tommaso, please. Yeah.
Well, actually, I agree with Harry that the impact of family is going to be even stronger than before. And it is not just because of time devoted to help students with their education, which is, of course, resources unlikely to be very lively across families, but it is especially for the cultural capital of the families. So families were able to help students in finding the right tools, instruments, way of coping with technology, helping them in the organization of their days, helping them in keeping pace with what teachers are asking. So this is something which is not just, I would say, economic differences, which technology can actually somehow leveling the playing field on the economic side. But from the social cultural point of view, it's going to be a real big difference. So considering how different parents can cope with these challenges will be a critical factor, not only in developments of Harry's work, but also in subsequent ones.
Okay, so I see that now I heard Sergey, so you can try again.
Can you hear me?
Super, okay.
Sorry, colleagues, thank you so much. I'll try to share a presentation. Just a moment.
That's what our kids had with their distance education.
Okay, could you see it?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, let's start. Oh, sorry. Sorry, just a moment. Yeah. Good morning and good afternoon. Sorry for my problems. Thank you so much for your perfect presentation, Harry. I see my contribution in the discussion about your question, what's supposed within countries, which territories, groups of children and young people are likely to suffer most from economic impact. One thesis about country specific. Tommaso mentioned the thing. Country differ in the duration of the school year and in the duration of vacation. And this is important to consider in evaluation. In Russia, one of the shortest school year. And now more than 2 months of school closure will add 3 months of vacation. I think it's important. Today, there are already quite a few attempts to extrapolate the negative effect of the summer slide on the situation with the closure of schools. You can see it at this slide. And the second about Russian case. For Russia, questions of in-country interregional comparisons are of critical importance. There are high levels of spatial disparities in Russia, unlike in the most comparable economies. We can see data your colleagues from World Bank comparing Russian regions. GRPPC differs across the regions by a high factor of 17. Similarly, another measure of spatial disparities, regional poverty rates, also is very different. And it's clear that these differences are apparent in the digital divide, broadband internet connection, household with personal computers. You can see such differences on the slide. And a lot of regions has lacked the resources to compensate for the problem in families. Not only poor, I should mention, not only poor and households, large families of average wealth. Our estimate, 34% of Russian regions are most vulnerable as they have few PCs in households and few laptops at schools. And you can see our calculation here. Approximate percentage of households with children under the age of 18 years without computers who can be provided with school laptops if they can help them. And other question, you can see the illustration of this differentiation. You can see that such a lot of children can catch their science and in some territories, teachers are forced to take home assignments, leave and pick up assignments in boxes in stores. But in considerable share of the region, we see a wide coverage of children with modern online learning platforms and services. It is important that interregional inequality is greater than interregional inequality, and we see similar patterns of differences and probably losses within regions. But let me distract from the picture of interregional differences to the picture of differences between social groups. I hear discussion about it, and I'd like to pay attention. The first polls show that low-income families experience the greatest difficulties in learning under conditions of pandemic. All the same digital divide and still possible family help. You can see municipal case, the differentiation between students from low-income families and middle-income families, which have PCs in smartphones. Harry has mentioned that some of loss will be mitigated by distance learning measures. I will risk to say more. The new learning environment, distance learning, may be not only compensation. The presented approach to assessment proceeds from the traditional model of learning, and the results it produces, knowledge, skills. Today, experts and now we together widely discuss the topic of future skills, which in the traditional system are poorly developed or even blocked. For example, my colleagues Isak, Froumin, and Pavel Sorokin focus on the topic of agency. In this context, it be assumed that the closure of schools created specific favorable chances for some children. This part is not great. These are, of course, children mainly from wealthy families who had remote access to educational resources. And by the way, in one of the large-scale Russian surveys of school children, we have data that 25% of the children saw new opportunities for themselves. It became interesting for them to try to learn differently. And perhaps the acquired experience and skills of self-organization, work in the digital environment will increase their price in the labor market and rise wages. Thank you so much for perfect presentation and for such interesting discussion.
Thank you, Sergey. And finally, it's great to have you with us. Unfortunately, we have to close, but maybe I will ask, no, I cannot, because in digital environment, I know that we have to finish on time and we have to start on time. So I think that, let me just sum up a bit. I think that today we mainly started the discussion. And we are grateful to Harry and his colleagues for framing the questions. And I hope that today's discussion helped us to frame them even more clearly. We see now what factors we have to take into account in analyzing the differences in school outcomes, in future labor market outcomes. And as a researcher, I think that it's a fascinating agenda for future research. And our webinars, our series of webinars will help to build this agenda and to involve more researchers in this topic. I would invite you to the next seminar on it will happen next Tuesday, and it will be about higher education, and it will be about student support in this, students of university students support in these difficult times. Professor Bruce Chapman from Australia will make a presentation of new loan scheme for students. So we hope to see you all again, and thanks to our great presenters. Goodbye.
Thanks, Isak. Thanks, Tommaso. Thanks, Sergey. Thanks, everyone, for the questions. I'll try to answer them on Twitter if you don't mind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.